Control the mic now. We'll try to not use the mic as much as possible, as long as I can hear and repeat what you have to say. But in some cases it may be beneficial to use a mic. So as you can see on the screen behind me, the first slide that we're looking at is talking about the field of medicine. And we talked last week about Leviticus 11 through 14. For it is the life of all flesh. Its blood sustains its life. And I mentioned to you that George Washington, that he had pneumonia, but way back then it was customary that they would actually drain blood from a person. And it was called bloodletting is what they would call it. But they would make an incision. Sometimes it was a small incision on the ear, but they felt that much of the diseases that occurred back then occurred in the blood. And they recognized enough that if they decreased the blood and everything, hopefully the person would survive. But George Washington knew that he was dying because they had been letting out quite a bit of blood. And so when you look on the internet at his death and everything, it said that he was lying there peacefully and he crossed his arms across his chest like this, knowing that he was dying, and he died peacefully. There are other things that they did back then that to some extent, some of it is still done today. One of those is leeches. They used to put leeches on people where they had a blood clot or a blood abnormally, and knowing that the leech would suck blood out of the individual. They still use that a little bit today. But one that they use today that Gene brought up to me that I'm going to mention. Some of you say no, Betty's already told me don't mention it, but I'm going to mention it, Betty, so you can close your ears. Because if you go to Mercy Hospital today, or you go to Baptist Integris Hospital, or for that matter, any hospital here in the Oklahoma City area, and if you have skin that is dying on your body, they will use this procedure, and it's a symbiotic relationship, if you will. But God knew this all along. He had planned this. And that is maggots. They will literally, and they do raise maggots in these hospitals. I've been in the labs, I've seen it done. And they will take a handful of these maggots and they will put it on the place on the human being where there is dying skin, because maggots will not eat fresh skin, living skin. It will only eat the dying skin or the dying flesh. And so it will cleanse the wound, if you will, so that the patient can properly heal. Well, again, that's a symbiotic relationship because obviously the maggot gets food, but the human being is treated successfully and able to heal their wound. Another one that we put up there, Genesis 3rd chapter, verse 15, which is medical science. And this, of course, God knew this all along. Man was a little bit confused early on. But Genesis 3:15 says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." The idea was, and is, that the seed of life is in the male and the female. Well, several writers of days gone by, including some of Moses' day, felt that only the male possessed the seed of life, and that the woman actually was little more than a glorified incubator. Now, women don't get insulted by this. This was days past. But one writer even suggested that the male seed could be deposited in warm mud, and the end result would be the same as placing it in the woman's womb. But Moses spewed forth no such nonsense. Rather, he stated the truth of the matter. But how did he know? Keep in mind, Moses wrote Genesis. And so how did Moses know then that the seed was in both man and woman? Well, the idea is obviously God. And God provided this information to Moses, and Moses put it in writing. And so way back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, we knew that. Well, also in Leviticus the 17th chapter, verse 15, it says, "And every person who eats what died naturally or what was torn by beast, whether he is a native of your own country or a stranger, he shall both wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening, then he shall be clean." Well, why is this necessary? And what are we talking about here? What was the Levitical writer talking about here? Do what?
Was it semen emission?
No, this has nothing to do with reproduction or anything. Let's read it again. And every person who eats what died naturally, or what was torn by beast, whether he is a native of your own country or a stranger, he shall both wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Then he shall be clean. And the idea was that Moses obviously was highly trained in public health procedures. The idea here is that when we eat, go to a restaurant or any place, we wash our hands before we eat, don't we? We make sure that we're clean, and much more so today than before. The vegetables, the produce that you buy from the grocery stores and everything, even though they say that it's washed and ready to eat, you look at all the health concerns and they'll tell you to wash it before you eat it, won't they? Because we understand that there are diseases out there that if we don't maintain a clean body, if we don't maintain clean clothing, we are going to experience diseases. Cal?
He was concerned about contamination he brought into the camp.
Exactly right. And we'll look at that a little bit more. For example, how many of you served in the military? I know some of you did. You were in the Navy, Gene. You had what they called heads. You know, you didn't have to go out on the ground and dig a latrine. But Dan had to dig a latrine. Cal had to dig a latrine. I had to dig a latrine. And where was that latrine placed? Huh? Outside the camp. Where it wasn't going to run back into the camp or anything, and it was dug at a specific dimension, and we had to do specific things to keep from disease spreading. The main disease that we were concerned about was what? Dysentery, exactly right. And so if you go to some of these third world countries today, they still use latrines. There are probably still people here in the United States that use what we call outhouses. Now, there are some of you here that used outhouses. I certainly used an outhouse when I was growing up. And we knew that we had to do certain things to make sure that it was sanitary. We knew we had to wash our hands when we left the outhouse and all of that. We knew that Sears and Roebuck catalog had to be placed in the outhouse. Dan?
Funny story. When we were in Vietnam, we had a pretty large outhouse, a three-holder.
Three-holder, huh? Wow.
And
big family.
Twice a week it had to be burned out. And the orders were use 5 gallons of diesel and 1 gallon of gas, take the screens off the outhouse and burn it out. And so one day a guy got it backwards. He used 5 gallons of gas.
Uh-oh.
And 1 gallon of diesel. And so we had to build a new house.
Yeah, I imagine so. Well, and even with outhouses, back during that day, we knew enough that when the hole began to fill up and everything, what did you do? You went out away from there and you dug another hole to place the outhouse on that hole, and then you covered this one up so that disease would not spread. Well, God knew this, and this is what the Levitical writer is talking about. We look at Leviticus 11th chapter, another one here.
I'm not going to tell her.
Yes.
What we talked about in Bible class.
You're not? Well, all right, I'll try to change the subject a little bit then. In Leviticus 11th chapter, verse 3, among the animals, whatever divides the hoof, having cloven hooves and chewing the cud, that you may eat. Well, why is that so? The pig is a scavenger. The pig had cloven hooves, but the pig did not chew a cud, and so therefore God had told them that they could not eat. This wasn't just because of the fact that they were Israelites and that he was saying specific things here, but God knew that there were certain animals that would spread disease. Gene, I see.
No, we didn't have to dig any holes in the ground. We permanently had seawater running through the flush system that all around.
Absolutely, yeah. And you did that to keep disease from spreading, obviously. So I didn't want to just totally exclude you from the military, Gene. I knew that the ships had specific systems and everything to keep disease from spreading. So thank you for bringing that up. So let's talk about the pig for a minute. The pig will eat anything that you put before it. Garbage. They'll even eat weeds. They'll even eat their own young. They are herbivores, and they are meat eaters. And when they do this, they occasionally ingest parasites. The parasite that we know very simply is the trichina worm. Now the trichina worm, if you ate pork that was not fully cooked, you would get this trichina worm in your muscles. And it can be very debilitating. Don't know that it's totally life-threatening. It can be life-threatening, but generally it's just debilitating because it will incapacitate you. Okay? Pigs are also known to be carriers as intermediate hosts of the tapeworm. And again, if you eat pork that is not fully cooked, you could get the eggs of the tapeworm and develop a tapeworm in your gastrointestinal tract. These tapeworms, they can cause tumors in the liver, they can cause tumors in the lungs, and other parts of the body. And it was for this reason that God told the Israelites that they were not to eat an animal unless it was a hooved animal that had split hooves and chewed a cud. Rabbits, another example. Rabbits will chew a cud, but they do not have cloven hooves. So therefore they were excluded from what the Israelites could eat. And you could look at other animals as well. But sheep and cattle were two animals that chew the cud and have cloven hooves, and so they were permitted to eat those. Goats is another one that they could eat. Now today, it's a different situation because the pork that you eat from the grocery stores today is all raised on concrete and is given a specific diet. And so if you ask the FDA today, they will tell you that it's okay to eat pork that's not overcooked. I doubt if any of you are willing to do that because you have been taught all your life that pork must be fully cooked before you eat it. However, if you did eat it medium well instead of well done, you would find that it's more flavorful, that it's more juicy. But back then, the pigs ate whatever was available. They rooted around in the ground, and so there was diseases. And God knew this, and so he said, don't eat it. Leviticus 11th chapter, verse 9. He said, these you may eat of all that are in the water. Whatever in the water has fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the rivers, that you may eat. It's interesting to note that poisonous fish have no scales. Now, catfish is not a poisonous fish, but there was a reason why catfish and those type fishes would not be eaten. Many of them that had no scales, obviously, are poisonous. The catfish is a scavenger, though. The catfish, like a pig, will eat anything. And if not properly prepared, you could pick up diseases. God knew this, and God told the Israelites that they should not eat these things. And the Israelites, being faithful, didn't question that. They did what God told them. Well, another one, Deuteronomy the 23rd chapter, verses 12 through 14. He said, also, you shall have a place outside the camp, and this is, we jumped ahead on this a little bit earlier, but this is the where you may go out. Verse 13, and you shall have an implement among your equipment, and when you sit down outside, you shall dig with it and turn and cover your refuse. And we talked about dysentery, and obviously the reason being is if you've never heard of the Black Plague, if you didn't properly dispose of your refuse, you could get the Black Plague. And in third world countries, this still exists today as a serious problem. Any comments or thoughts so far? Okay, still looking at the field of medicine, in Genesis the 17th chapter, verse 12, he who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised. Every male child in your generations, he who is born in your house or bought with money from any foreigner who is not your descendant. Now why 8 days old? Why did God specifically say, wait until the 8th day before you circumcise the male baby? Pat?
The blood will coagulate at that time
Okay.
in their life.
All right. Dan?
I was just going to say, modern medicine has found out that that is the best time for blood clotting and for healing in the life of the child.
Absolutely right. And this is exactly what is on the next slide. In humans, blood clotting is dependent upon 3 factors: platelets, vitamin K, and prothrombin. And in 1935, Professor H. Dam proposed the name vitamin K for the factor that helped prevent hemorrhaging in chicks. And we now realize that vitamin K is responsible for the production by the liver of prothrombin. If the quantity of vitamin K is deficient, there will be a prothrombin deficiency and hemorrhaging may occur. It is only on the 5th to 7th days of a newborn's life that vitamin K is produced by the action of bacteria in the intestinal tract is present in adequate quantities. Vitamin K coupled with prothrombin causes blood coagulation, which is important in any surgical procedure. Now, I may be wrong on this, but I think today, because of modern medicine, they don't wait until the 8th day to circumcise the male child. Yeah, within the first couple of days. But modern medicine has a way of clotting the blood.
Well, they also give them a vitamin K shot as a newborn.
Vitamin K shot, yeah. And that's the thing about modern science and modern medicine, even going back to pigs and everything. It's a known fact that pigs require iron. And that's one of the reasons why pigs will root in dirt and everything to get the iron out of the dirt. So when they're raised on concrete, the first thing they have to do is they clip their needle teeth and they give them an iron shot. Plus they have heat lamps to keep them away from the sow so that she doesn't lay on them or doesn't decide to eat them because they will sometimes turn on their young. So modern science has learned these things, but God knew these things all along, and the scriptures tell us this at the very beginning. Okay, so any questions on the field of medicine now from the scriptures? All right, let's look at the field of biology. In Genesis, the 1st chapter, verse 11, then God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb and that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth," and it was so. And then in verse 12, "And the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind, and God saw that it was good." And then we see in Genesis 1:21, "So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind, and God saw that it was good." In verse 24, "Then God said, Let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth, each according to its kind, and it was so." This is the science of genetics back in 1900. They knew that things had to be reproduced after its kind. For example, if you mated a lion with a tiger, will they reproduce? Will they? Huh? They will reproduce, but they will always be sterile. Therefore, you cannot create a new species. It's the same thing as if you bred a horse to a donkey. You will get a mule because there's good qualities about both animals. Donkeys are stubborn and good work animals. Horses have the power, so you breed them together. You get the stubborn and the work ethic, and you get the power. But the mule is sterile. It cannot reproduce. God produced everything after its kind. Now, we'll talk a little bit about evolution a little bit later, because I'm not talking about the fact that there are little differences that evolve. And I'll just give you one example. When you look at dogs and everything, you have a Chihuahua, a little bitty fella, and you have a Great Dane. They are dogs. So there is some evolution there. You look at horses, you have the Shetland pony and you have the horse or the Clydesdale. There is a little bit of difference in evolution there, but they're still after its own kind. And God produced everything after its own kind. If you have, you look in the seed catalogs today, and you see this wonderful fruit tree here that bears 5 kinds of fruit. That's not natural. In fact, Florence just bought a pear tree that has 5 different varieties of pears on it. We think. We'll see. But she says, I don't see how it's going to do this. So I took her out the other day. I says, I want to show you these grafts. They're just little buds right now, but there's 5 different grafts on this stalk. That's the only way it's going to do it. It's not natural. God didn't create things that way. And He said specifically in Genesis that everything was created after its own kind. And so when you're studying with someone, they say, well, what about this? All you have to do is say, did you look and see the grafts? Have you ever seen an animal that was crossbred between a tiger and a lion breed with another animal that's crossbred between the two? Have you ever seen a mule breed another mule? No. So God knew what He was doing when He created these things. And He said they will be after their own kind. I mean, this is just speculation, but just imagine if it was by chance. And everything was breeding and everything. And what kind of creations would we have today?
Star Wars.
Probably so. But the fact is, God knew what He was doing, and God's creation should never be questioned because it is a valid creation, and it is the creation. So, the Bible is inspired of God. Jeremiah 36 verses 22 and 23 says, Now the king was sitting in the winter house in the 9th month with a fire burning on the hearth before him. And it happened when Jehudi had read 3 or 4 columns that the king cut it with the scribe's knife and cast it into the fire that was on the hearth until all the scroll was consumed in the fire that was on the hearth. So, the Bible is inspired by God then. Many have set themselves against God in the Bible for generations. They've tossed them in the fire during the Middle Ages. Centuries later, French skeptic Voltaire, 50 years, no longer discussed among the people. The Bible. In 1900, American infidel Robert Ingersoll claimed in 15 years, but the morgue took him. The governments come and go, nations rise and fall, people live and die, but the Bible has endured forever, and the Bible is still the #1 selling book in the world today. And you look at this series, Bible series that's been on Sunday night, and I guess the follow-up was on Monday night and everything. It's interesting to note that they had the largest audience of young people watch that show. Largest audience. So that tells me one thing, that young people are interested in God's Word. The sad thing about it is, many things that was in that show was not according to the Scriptures and was embellished. Movies, actors and actresses will do that to make something fit where it's more dramatic and everything. But there was a lot of that certainly would capture the interest of young people. And that says that if the Lord's church will just do its job and continue to faithfully work and look for opportunities to teach others, that there are a lot of young people out there that want to know the truth. And we have the opportunity. Now that series, I don't know how much the Life Church was involved in it, but I know that they were involved in it to a great extent. Downing and her husband, if you know her, she was the young actress that played the young angel in Touched by an Angel. It was the two of them that produced the series. But it wasn't, it was about 3 or 4 weeks ago that they were at the Life Church over here at Edmond, promoting that whole series and working with the Life Church on it. So there was certainly some denominational doctrine in it, and I don't want to get into a lot of deal about it other than the fact that it drew a lot of interest among young people, and that's a positive thing. The Bible will never die. There will always be a remnant, and God knew that. So, Matthew 24, verse 35. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. And Isaiah 40, verse 8. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. Any comments? Now we're going to spend just a little bit not looking at scriptures because we need to address a few things about evolution. I've touched on it off and on throughout this series of lessons. But I want to touch on it a little bit because there are some things we'll look at in the scripture. For example, the fire-breathing dragon. We'll look at that scripture and I'll try to explain to you why that probably did exist. And I have some good proof today to suggest that it existed. But people will say that was evolution, that if there was a fire-breathing dragon, it lived thousands or millions of years ago. Not so. So, when we look at evolution and creation, when we look at the definition of evolution, it literally means unfolding or unrolling. This is accepted by all. In fact, Mark 4, verse 28, for the earth yields crops by itself, first the blade, then the head, after that the full grain of the head. Now, the theory of evolution rejects the notion that all organisms were designed and created at the beginning of time. This is the matter to man, or molecules to man, evolution in which there is no God, first cause or divine intervention. We are not using the word evolution here in these lessons to refer to the special theory of evolution, which states that limited change within kinds can be observed, and that's what I was talking about earlier. Dan?
That's just simply adaptation.
Yeah, it's an adaptation.
It's like some of the lizards that live in the desert because of the horns that certain ones of them had, were able to dissipate heat better. They lived, and so they, when they bred another lizard, the only ones that remained were the ones that had the horns, and so that's adaptation. That's not evolution.
Exactly right. And man can create new breeds. I'll give you an example. When we lived up in Idaho, we purchased a cat for our son and daughter at that time that was half Persian and half Burmese. And what they were doing was creating a new breed called exotic short hairs. They wanted the bony structure of the Persian, but they wanted the short hair of the Burmese. That breed has been created. But that was an adaptation. It was not evolution. And it was not creating something outside of the realm of God. And many of the creatures that we see today, when you look at the cattle, anybody familiar with the Brangus brand? The Brangus cattle is nothing more than a breed that was created from an Angus and a Brahma. And the Brangus breed is in existence today. You can take a Brangus male and a Brangus female and it will produce a Brangus calf. We have Beefalo today. Buffalo is, in fact, a species like cattle, and therefore it will breed with cattle. And all they did was took a buffalo and bred it to a type of cattle, creating the Beefalo because they wanted something that would tolerate drier areas with little moisture. And the buffalo can tolerate those low moisture areas where many cattle cannot. So there's various breeds like that that have been established, but it's adaptation. It's not evolution. Any thoughts? All right. So, then when we talk about evolution, then everybody first off accepts the fact that evolution allows for limited change within its kinds. And that's what we were talking about, okay? But the theory of evolution may be defined as the hypothesis that millions of years ago, lifeless matter, acted upon by natural forces, gave origin to one or more minute living organisms, which have since evolved into all living and extinct plants and animals, including man. Belief in change with descent from a common ancestor. Okay? So the general theory of evolution states that changes occur which allow one kind of animal or plant to become another. The question is then, is the general theory of evolution a fact or science? Special theory is the question I'm asking here. This can be demonstrated in certain cases by experiments, and what we're talking about here is the theory which states that many living animals can be observed over the course of time to undergo changes so that new species are formed. But it's like kinds. It's not outside of the realm. Like I was talking about the Brangus cattle, the beefalo, and the exotic short-haired cat. Okay?
You know what, Dale?
Yes.
What I was thinking, you know, when the scripture says that they'll worship the creature rather than the creator, man is taking what God put here in all its perfection. And if you'll ever notice, a lot of the breeds that you're talking about, if it's flowers or whatever it is, they're never as strong when they graft the rose or some of the things you're talking about. They never have the quality that the original one did.
You're
And,
exactly
you know,
right.
And so I think that man has gotten obsessed with what he looks at something that he's creating, whether it's in vitro fertilization or going outside of the bounds of whatever nature is and what God's created. And that's how they're worshiping the creature. Don't you think?
Well, I agree with you, and you're exactly right when you talk about the thing that man had created is never as strong as the thing that God created. We can look at our plants that we have grafted onto other plants, and we can see that. If a strong wind comes along, what happens? The graft breaks off because it's never as strong. The other thing we see is that these grafted plants never produce like the original plant that God created. Yes, Mike?
I've even seen cases where they've taken like a hybrid of something, and after a few years, it'll actually lose its hybridization, and it'll actually revert back to its earlier form. So that, to me, is de-evolution.
Exactly right. And it goes to show that God knew what he was doing at the very beginning. And when man tries to interfere with what God did and everything, it will always revert back to what God did. Cal?
And you see that in like hybrid tomatoes. If you let them go to seed, next year, after a couple of years, your tomatoes can be a lot smaller, but they're going to be sweeter and have more nutrients.
Sweeter and juicier and more nutrients.
So when we genetically modify these foods, which we're doing,
And what do you see now when you go to Lowe's and Home Depot and all this place? You're seeing a big trend going back to what they call heirloom vegetables. They're going back to the original because they know the original is better. So, yeah, Cal.
what I want to point out is genetically modified foods are not the foods that God created. And they're finding out that they do not give us the food value that we want, and they don't perform in our bodies when we digest them the way the original foods did.
That's true. Mike, you had another comment?
I was going to say that, you know, a lot of your evolutionists, they don't look at it as theory. They'll say it's irrefutable fact. And my question is, you know, they've got at their disposal the perfect laboratory with all the perfect elements. They supposedly know all the, you know, they have ability to recreate the heat of a volcano. You know, they can do all these different things inside of a laboratory setting. So why can't they take a single cell organism and reproduce it into a four-legged fur-bearing animal?
Yeah,
Why can't they?
because it's outside of God's law.
It has to happen by chance, I guess.
Well, that's true, yeah.
But scientifically, but to me, for something to be proven scientifically, you have to be able to reproduce it over and over and
It's a
over
scientific
and over.
method.
That's for scientific.
We've all taken science classes and everything, and I know this is kind of comical, but this is exactly what happens with science and everything. There's the story about the guy, the scientist who was studying fruit flies. And so he takes a fruit fly, and you know that was one of the flies that we all used in science, wasn't it? Because they would reproduce real quick and you could mutate them and everything. He takes the fruit fly and he puts it in his hand and he says, "Fly away, fly." The fly flies away. So then he takes and he writes his in his book and everything. And then he takes another fruit fly and he pulls the legs off of it and puts it in his hand. He says, "Fly away, fly." And the fly flies away. So then he takes a third fly and he puts it in his hand, but he pulls the wings off before he puts it in his hands. And he says, "Fly away, fly," and the fly just sits there. He says, "Fly away, fly," and the fly just sits there. So then he yells at the fly, "Fly away, fly," and the fly just sits there. So in his book, his hypothesis was that when you pull the wings off of fruit flies, they become hard of hearing and they can't fly. And that's pretty much the way science is. All right, so general theory, on the other hand, there is a theory that all living forms in the world have arisen from a single source, which itself came from an inorganic form. The topic of origins falls in the realm of theology, metaphysics, or philosophy, but certainly not science. And so when we think about this, microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution is small changes like the improvement of animal stock, change within bounds, differentiation, variation, fluctuation, and there is no disagreement there. We would all agree with it. That's adaptation. Macroevolution, that's large changes. Darwin and other modern evolutionary theories demand these large changes. Water animal becoming a creeping thing, which becomes a beast, which becomes a man. So, when we look at the limitations of science then, the first thing we need to understand is the scientific method is limited to what can be observed with the five senses. And the scientific method then is limited to the present. This, of course, is self-evident. Science is limited to the present since that is the only place and time in which the five senses operate. And since science is based upon observation, it is obvious that true science must limit its scope to human history, where things can be properly observed and recorded. And then the scientific method is limited to telling us how a process works and not why it works. Science can give us the know-how, but it cannot give us the know-why. And also then, the scientific method is limited in that it is amoral, non-moral. In other words, Paul Little in Know Why You Believe says that it should be recognized that science is incapable of making value judgments about the things it measures. Many men on the frontiers of science are realizing that there is nothing inherent in science to guide them in the application of the discoveries they make. There is nothing in science itself which will determine whether nuclear energy will be used to destroy cancer or to destroy cities. Science simply then does not have the mechanism, by definition of its own method, to legislate or deal effectively with morals. And by definition is not equipped to deal with morals or values. And then the scientific method is limited in that it cannot deal with the unique. In other words, the scientific method deals with those things that are, number one, timeless, 2, universal, 3, dependable, and 4, repeatable at will. And those things which do not fit in these categories are outside the realm of science by definition. So, Sir Thomas Huxley, the famous Darwinian advocate who referred to himself as Darwin's bulldog, once stated that science is simply common sense at its best, that is, rigidly accurate in observation and merciless to fallacy and logic. Fallacy and logic has been committed by some scientists when they assert that science is the ultimate court of appeals that can be invoked to answer all questions. And true science, when used properly, is indeed grand. But when it's used improperly, obviously it's not. And scientists who should know better And those infatuated with science, who needs to be taught better, have committed the reproductive fallacy, taking one small part of science and stating that it is the whole. And that's the problem with science today. So, when we look at evolution and creation then, evolution is an attempt to explain from an atheistic viewpoint the existence of living things. Creationism is an attempt to explain from a theistic point of view the existence of living things, and theistic evolution is the viewpoint that since we cannot explain all the problems with evolution, let's add God to the equation. And only then would they consider adding God to the equation. So, the idea then of evolution is that all of the plants and animals which we have today have gradually developed from a single cell billions of years ago. And evolutionists believe this came about by natural selection working on chance variations, and natural selection is the survival of the fittest. So there are 7 basic assumptions, and I'll try to mention those fairly quickly. The first assumption is non-living things gave rise to living material. Non-living things. How that happened, you know, the theory is that there's this little pebble that kept getting irritated and everything, and eventually it developed life cells and grew into something. Well, that's an assumption. But then we had the spontaneous generation that occurred only once. And thirdly, viruses, bacteria, plants, and animals are all interrelated. Fourth, the protozoa single-celled organisms gave rise to the metazoa multicelled organisms. Fifth, the various invertebrate phyla organisms without a backbone are interrelated. Sixth, the invertebrates gave rise to the vertebrates, animals with backbones. And seventh, within the vertebrates, the fish gave rise to the amphibia to the reptiles, and the reptiles to the birds and mammals. All right, so that's the second bell, so we'll stop here, and we'll continue on next week then.